When you think of wasted potential, you think of vanilla World of Warcraft, and the fact that it took retail 20 years to go through all those original unfinished stories. For example, Hyjal and Cataclysm, Gilneas and Cataclysm, the Blood Elves and the High Elves in TBC, Northrend and Wrath of the Lich King. So many little plot points that were developed and built all the way back from 2001 to 2004. Heck, some of them go back to 1999. And that's the reason that Classic Plus has been in the people's forefront, the mind of the desire and the dream for this effective WoW 2, right? We're never gonna get a WoW 2, kind of like League of Legends just announced League 2, League Next, where they just rebuild the client, or Overwatch 2, where they take the original game, fix and tweak a few things, or make it worse, and then release that. That's the best WoW 2 is ever going to be. But Classic Plus is the real, in my opinion, attempt at finishing World of Warcraft in its original intended manner. Now, there's a lot of cut content, and I'm going to try to keep this video to 30 minutes or less, but that's probably not going to be the case. Now, we're going to start off with zones, and there's a lot of them to cover, but we're going to start off with the big ones, right? Everybody is aware of. Hyjal right off the rip. Now, in Hyjal, if you guys aren't aware, in Cataclysm they changed almost all of the original story beats, but back in vanilla, back on that original idea, Hyjal was meant to be the quest and attempt to stop the resurrection of Archimonde. Now, they never really got very far into development for a lot of these storylines and plot beats, so we're working off with a couple of sentences the devs have said over the years. We're not working off with a lot of information because it was very early content that was cut a long time ago. But based off that, resurrection of Archimonde, the themes around that, stopping the demons and the cultists from getting the Burning Legion back in power, because keep in mind that back in Warcraft 3 and back in, vanilla, Archimonde was this huge big bad. It took somebody like Malfurion and over 10,000 whiffs sacrificing themselves and exploding to kill Archimonde. You guys don't know this because Malfurion's storytelling in game has been terrible, but he is a Deus Ex Machina character. Malfurion is so strong he could solve every single expansion's plot by himself. The reason his storyline is so dog shit is because he's so strong that they can't even use Malfurion correctly. It's why so much dumb shit happens, because they have to like hand wave his ultimate power away. He is the strongest mortal in game. If they let Malfurion do it, he'd clap Deathwing's cheeks. He'd clap most people's cheeks. The Lich King, all these people would be weak compared to Malfurion. So they just hand wave him out. He's sleeping. He's gone. He's Magic Boogaloo too, whatever reason. Malfurion literally held the fucking continent in his hands. Like, people don't realize how powerful this man is, and they're never going to utilize him correctly. But in Warcraft 3 they did. In Warcraft 3, Malfurion with his power came and was still weaker than Archimonde. And then of course, as the storyline has progressed, Archimonde's not even a top 3 big bad anymore. He's a nobody, unimportant, irrelevant. He was somebody capable of immense power, immense cataclysm. And that is not the case anymore. So now that we've got the lore out the way, the resurrection of Archimonde would spell the end of Azeroth, right? There is no more World Tree and this bajillion of wisps to explode and kill him. So if Archimonde gets resurrected, we lose. That's effectively the story beat. So there'd be these huge raid dungeons, quest lines, and they did plan on having 2 raids in Hyjal. Again, the Barrow Dens kind of thing. There's the Nyxia cave entrance inside of Hyjal. You guys have probably seen it in a dozen videos. R.I.P. Haven, he made a really good video about that. But effectively, when you look at that, you see their plans, their whole desires and goals, and it's something that was so grand they left it for later. And then when they came back to it, they decided that this doesn't really fit the pipeline and theme we're going for, so we're going to scrap it. Because Cataclysm was about Deathwing. And resurrecting Archimonde's going to clap Deathwing's cheeks if they kept his original power, right? So they couldn't just have, oh my god, we got to stop the resurrection of this bigger bad than the big bad destroying Azeroth. So it became this issue of scrap it, reuse the story beats of Hyjal for other things. And that's what they ended up doing. But in Classic Plus, in this hypothetical alternate timeline, Hyjal would be a zone where we deal with the aftermath of Archimonde and the Burning Legion and the lost factions of the humans, the orcs, the night elves, all dealing with the demons still remaining in Hyjal because there is still a demonic Burning Legion influence over there. It's why that Falskar path over going from Winterspring into Hyjal is full of demons. The Burning Legion still has a presence on Azeroth. Not a big presence, but a couple of pit lords, a couple of Eredar, some strong NPCs. There was plenty of ways to utilize a raid here. Multiple raids, multiple dungeons. So in Classic Plus, what would this look like? We have the Archimonde storyline stopping his resurrection, probably a legendary item like the Skull of Archimonde or the Eredar Staff of Doom or some bullshit, right? Whatever they end up doing, they can do any kind of legendary. Very easy to design. There's so many themes they could go with to make a really sick legendary for a caster, a warrior, a necklace, like there's anything. It's not very difficult to make this legendary a cool item. But the raids, the Barrow-dens, Maiev and the aftermath of chasing Illidan, they can deal with the remnants and the things forgotten underground. They can make a demon raid. A full raid fighting demons. For example, the entrance to Hyjal, they could make that a raid. That we get into Hyjal by defeating the remnants of the Burning Legion. And that's how we unlock Hyjal. They make a demon raid out of it. We gotta push through the demons, destroy their stronghold, their stranglehold over that area, the entrance of Hyjal. And behind that would then be all the factions and the storylines and the beats coming afterwards. So that's 2 raids right there. What about dungeons? Flashback to Archimonde sieging. Like, for example, the TBC raid, but a smaller, condensed version of that. Or, for example, they could make a minier version of the Barrow-den raid, but as a dungeon. They could make a troll dungeon there, because there's still some troll fragments, or should be, left over. The Dark Trolls, the people that the Night Elves evolved from. So, there are so many story facets, and raid facets, and dungeon facets that they could do, that it would be easy to fill Hyjal with content that could last not just 1 phase, but 2, 3, 4, 5 phases. Hyjal isn't some small zone, some small area, some small aspect of content. It is overloaded with content. Whether they're gonna go with the future versions of the Firelands and all that bullshit, which I hope they don't. I hope for Classic Plus they keep with the original intentions and finish that. They have so much to work with that if Hyjal is utilized as a 1 phase, I would be severely disappointed. I think it should launch as a phase and we come back to it in a separate phase, kind of like, for example, Blackrock Mountain, where we had Molten Core and then Blackwing Lair. So I think that would be the better design for Hyjal as a place we go back to. So say phase, after we go through phase 1 through 3, or 1 through 4, for example, Molten Core through Naxx, then we get Hyjal phase 5, then yada yada yada, then like phase 9 we go back to Hyjal. That would be cool in my opinion. Now, this next one is one I don't think we're getting in Classic Plus anytime soon, because in Season Discovery, when they tried to utilize the Emerald Dream, it kind of was a shit show with incursions, and I think they're going to put it to the back burner and at a much later phase if they do use it, but it's the Emerald Dream. Now, the Emerald Dream is something that was designed in vanilla. It was meant to be in vanilla, and it was effectively a continent-sized location that the devs ran out of time to finish. They had a whole bunch of plot beats between Malfurion, all the druids, the sleeping nightmares. For example, Wailing Caverns had tie-ins to the Emerald Dream. But so many of the story beats just wouldn't make it because dev time. In fact, even in retail, we still don't have access to the Emerald Dream, at least in like the full grand scheme, grand design of it. We've been to the Emerald Dream a dozen times so far, but no like full Emerald Dream zone, continent, or location. And I don't count Shadowlands at all. Shadowlands is not canon. They've decanonized so much of Shadowlands that anything from Shadowlands, for the most part, can be written off unless the devs actively confirm it in new source material as being accurate. Because as of right now, they've effectively hand-waved and retconned a shit ton of Shadowlands, and for the most part, you can ignore that expansion unless they reference something from it specifically in new content and new lore. So, Classic WoW or Classic Plus's Emerald Dream, what would that really look like? Well, based off the original intentions, it would be about the druids, all the druidic circles and factions, the corruption of the nightmare, the old gods, because there's so many like little influences. For example, Il'gynoth from the raid in Legion. If you guys remember that, the whispers, the mysteries. There are so many dark, corrupting influences into the Emerald Dream. And even right now with the Haranya in Midnight WoW, They've talked about the edge, the darkness, there's so many mysteries surrounding it that the Emerald Dream is effectively infinite content, infinite ways to utilize. And the original plans, I have to keep it real, the devs made shit up and then never went into detail on it. So we are quite literally pulling scraps of information. Now I'm going to read a couple of quotes from like Mark Kern or Tigol about the thing, right? Mark Kern said that the original idea was when you die, you go to the Emerald Dream. You'd meet lore characters who had died, receive quests, and either return via spirit guide or state of progress quest inside the dream. So it would be a side-by-side continent. So when you died, you would effectively go to the Emerald Dream and you would quest there until you chose to come back to the realm of the living. So it would be alternate levels of questing. And then Tigol in 2003 described it as a massive, beautiful endgame zone, explicitly endgame and extremely challenging. Later, Blizzard said they had done a lot of work on Emerald Dream but scrapped it in favor of bigger plans, eventually reusing Art and Emerald, Nightmare, Dreamway, Dragonflight's dream zones. So they effectively spent 20 years going through backwards and utilizing so much of the Emerald Dream because they couldn't make it fit or work in the original landscape. Now for Classic, does that mean the Emerald Dream is going to be this alternate content that when you die you go quest there? No. I don't think they could effectively fix the code or change the code base to work like that, where you're questing and getting experience and fighting while you're dead. Because that would require a lot of back-end work. That would effectively be a full new game style and gameplay loop. And I think that would break Classic as a whole if they tried to do that. Now don't quote me, I'm not an engineer. I don't work on back-end technology. I don't actually know what that would really end up looking like. But that is just my theory and my opinion. So the realistic way is how Tigol described it. A massive, beautiful endgame zone, explicitly endgame and extremely challenging. I expect this to be like a hard mode zone, like, you know, every mob is like level 50, 65, 66, 67, so you need a group the entire time you're there. You cannot play there solo, you need to go with 5 people or a raid team. All the content is excessively hard, to the point where you need a guild and a community to actually do things. Multiple open world dungeons, make it incredibly hard to actually sit there and farm things for bots, for example, because of how challenging it is. Add random mechanics where everybody has to be paying attention a lot of the time. Make the rewards worth it, make it very profession heavy. But again, they never really shared all their details because they didn't actually get super far into development because they realized how much time it would take, and it would take away from the actual vanilla experience. We'd be missing so many zones, ideas, dungeons, raids if they spent the time actually working on the Emerald Dream that they originally intended. So with that said, will the devs actually go and redo Emerald Dream the original way? Very unlikely. I think for the Classic devs team and the Classic Plus team, it's going to be something that's 2-3 years out. They might utilize it the same way they did, for example, the Incursion, small little hubs for the Emerald Dream, like a portal to an Emerald Dream zone. One zone, not a full continent. Max level zone, a portion of the Emerald Dream reutilized correctly, showcasing some like sleeping character, like scenarios or things like that, right? But I don't think at any real fragment we are going to get the continent of the Emerald Dream as this ginormous new progression area for a new version of the endgame. I think eventually we might, but I think it's going to be a long time before that ever actually happens. Now, in regards to raids, super easy, right? They can make up anything. You know, Scenarios' Nightmares, which is like, you know, the Warcraft 3 Orc campaign, where Garrosh Hellscream kills Scenarios. Things like that, they can make that into a raid, like reliving that trauma and that memory. Dungeons, there's a dime a dozen they could make up. The Harpies, the Elementals, the Void, the Corruption, the Druids, like they can do effectively anything to make a dungeon. It wouldn't be super difficult. They can even make a Quillboar one where the Quillboar Nightmare Dreams are infecting their Emerald Dream. Now, if you guys remember, you guys have seen this image, the ginormous Dragon Isle scrapped in vanilla. This huge zone, ginormous temple, Alexstrasza being a raid boss initially, as was intended, because initially the dragons hated all of us. It's why the red dragonflight, the green dragonflight, all the dragonflights for the most part are hostile. It's because we, the players, whether you're the Horde or the Alliance, aren't exactly friends of the dragons, right? For example, in the human campaign in Warcraft 3, you kill dragons. You know, in the Northrend campaign, you kill dragons. The dragons have been hunted and, like, you know, abused by the players quite a bit. And initially, before they really made the lore as it is, before like Deathwing and everything was fully written out, the dragons were just kind of like angry, powerful creatures that hated us. Now this is very old lore that I'm mentioning, right? Because Deathwing, Alexstrasza, and all that stuff, there's novels from that from 2001 and 2 and all that stuff, and even before that, I think 1999. But based off the original thing, Alexstrasza did not like us, and she was a villain. Whether we killed her or she was just like she was helping us, they never really fully fleshed out the storyline for the Dragon Isles, because the original plan was max level. That's another thing I'm going to mention later in the video. But the original max level was 70, but I'll cover that later on. Alexstrasza was a level 70 raid boss. That's what they planned, but they never got around to that. So I'm going to show you guys some of I'm going to talk to you guys about some of these things. It was meant to be a level 65 to 70 zone with a raid north of Lordaeron featuring multiple old god temples. It was small islands labeled as a raid north of Kalthalas with the label Alexstrasza, level 70, right, as the raid. It was an old god temple archipelago and not the Drakthia homeland in Dragonflight. It was a completely different style of like zone or continent. John Sass explains they were cut before beta, despite that the little islands remained visible on the in-game map until Wrath removed them. Concept art shows Nautilus/hermit crab shaped old god temples associated with this zone. Pieces of this visual language later show up as the Master's Glaive and the Shrine of the Storm. So from that perspective, the OG Dragon Isles is just a void and the dragons fighting each other and dealing with like the remnants, because the dragons are very ancient races, right? They are pre-Titan, the original, for example, Galakrond. And how, you know, all that drama happened, and Dragonflight, they addressed that as well with the primal dragons. I think they're called primal dragons in Dragonflight, don't quote me on that. But you guys see these things here and how it all comes together to effectively show how the original devs had completely different intentions than what the future devs ended up implementing. Now keep in mind that Chris Metzen wrote so much lore. He wrote so much shit, and based on what people have quoted and said about him, he would write something, forget what he wrote, and then rewrite it. Or he would write something, come back later, not like what he initially wrote, and then rewrote it. So for a lot of these things, Chris Metzen himself changed his original plans. But that brings up the concept of, do we care about the author's intent in the long term, or do we care about the original intent? So when you look at Classic Plus and Classic being finished, do we want to finish the original intent, or do we want to finish Chris Metzen's modernized intent? And in my opinion, Chris Metzen's modernized intent should be left for retail. He's back, he's fleshing that out, he's fixing that. And I think for Classic Plus, we should be finishing and exploring the OG development style, the OG development cycle of what the game was initially intended to be. Because for a lot of people, despite Cataclysm, despite Wrath or TBC or MOP being Chris Metzen's projects and being written and designed by him, a lot of people don't like MOP. They don't consider MOP to be classic or retail. They don't like Cataclysm. Despite Cataclysm having good features, Cataclysm is the first step into the retailification of the game. And the story beats and the characters, people aren't the fondest, they don't have the fondest memories of it. Whereas Vanilla is, for a lot of the classic player base, the epitome. Now TBC systems were meant to be classic systems, but they just got pushed to TBC, and again I'll cover that later on in the video. But you guys can see how we enter this era of the development issue of what should the devs for Classic Plus be trying to do? Finish the original design, finish the original intentions, or utilize the original intention and design to keep the game developed in the original development style. And that's something we're not really sure that's going to happen in Classic Plus. We don't know which direction the devs are going to be taking. Now, for those of you that aren't aware, there are two big islands called the Isle of Lepidus and Dr. Gilligam's Isle, right? And Now, for those of you that aren't aware, there are two massive islands just off the coast of Stranglethorn Vale, and they are the island of Dr. Lepidus and Gilligam's Isle. Now, these zones existed in alpha and were on official maps, but by 1.x or whatever, they were no longer in the game and you couldn't visit them or go to them or even see them on the map. And the original intentions of the island of Dr. Lepidus was a troll ruin island in the South Seas off Stranglethorn, north of Gilligam's Isle. It appeared in the WoW Alpha, the 2006 world map poster, the game manual, and in the WoW comic. They never explicitly said why they removed the content. They never finished it or fully designed it. There's a lot of empty assets and like broken things on this island. Same thing with Gilligam's Isle, another jungle troll island south of Lepidus, visible in the classic intro cinematic and early maps. The location existed in the alpha of Cataclysm, but by Cataclysm its subregion name was removed. Now, how should they utilize these? They never fully fleshed them out. There was some ogre stuff, some troll stuff, some, Naga, Murloc things, some goblin things I assume would likely going to be there. Dr. Gilligan, I know they were making references to movies and things like that. That's how they used to name things, like a lot of creative pop culture references. So how would they utilize this in Classic Plus? Honestly, however the fuck they want. I'm gonna keep it real. This doesn't have that many notes or that much lore. Like, the devs never really considered it to be a super big or interesting thing. They made these islands and then decided, not really worth it, and removed them. They were just extra islands. They can do whatever they want. There are so many things they could do for these. They could make a troll, ogre, dungeon, raid, Naga invasion, helping Booty Bay establish a colony. Like, whatever story beat or theme they want, it doesn't hurt us or affect us in any particular way. It's not super important. The islands themselves are important culturally to Classic because they're this big mystery that people, like where they go, why they go. And the devs have mentioned it before offhandedly, like, they just weren't that important. That's literally it. They just weren't that important. They were throwaway places they made and just forgot about. It just wasn't worth finishing. So for Classic Plus, they have full freedom. Pick any of the themes. Goblin, Naga, Troll, Ogre, Massive Beast, Dinosaurs, do what you want. It's not going to really affect anything, and it'll be cool regardless. Add a quest, heck, maybe even add a raid to Stranglethorn Vale, make these zones level 60, make them leveling zones. Heck, you could even make one a PvP zone. It doesn't really matter, right? Like, anything is cool here. I don't have a preferential idea either way, because again, I in my opinion, should be based off original intentions, and the devs never really finished their original intention or design philosophy for this. So be free, be creative, do something that's fun that the player base wants to enjoy, but stick to one of the themes that they've put there. Now, Stranglethorn Vale, very PvP thematic. People have memories of being ganked and camped, so I do think a PvP battleground on one of the islands would be really sick. I think it'd be a really cool thing. Or an open world PvP battleground, for example, like the Gurubashi Arena, but large scale. Cool mount rewards, pet rewards. You get a currency that you can use to buy consumes or whatever, make PvP players feel rewarded for their time. There's so many things you could do. Pick anything. You surprise the player base, because anything will be cool. Now we got Outland. Outland was meant to be in vanilla. Illidan was meant to be in vanilla. Black Temple was meant to be in vanilla. This shit got scrapped very, very early. Not because it's bad, not because they didn't want to do it, because time. A lot of Classic WoW's development that got scrapped was solely because of time. Nothing else. Genuinely was time. TBC was meant to be the finished version of vanilla. Keep in mind, the original level cap was 70. A lot of TBC zones, for example, Hyjal with the Battle for Mount Hyjal, and Outland and Hellfire Peninsula and the Black Temple and Illidan, all of this was meant to be. Even the Blood Elves, the Draenei were new, that was something they added later on. But the Blood Elves, Ghostlands and Silvermoon City, that was all meant to be in vanilla. And so we got that in TBC. So, based off that, this is a question I want you guys to answer in the comments down below. Should the devs add Hellfire Peninsula to vanilla, to Classic Plus? Just Hellfire Peninsula, by the way, because the original, if you guys look at the original map of Draenor or Outland from Warcraft 3, it was mostly Hellfire Peninsula. So Hellfire Peninsula was like this ginormous thing. Outland was broken and ruined across for the most part. Shadowmoon Vale and Hellfire Peninsula was effectively everything. So should they add those two reimagined to fit in that classic theme to vanilla WoW as a phase? Or should they not? It's something we have to consider, because for some people that's TBC, even though it was an original idea and design plan for vanilla. So I'm curious what you guys would prefer, but now let's dive into the information here, right? John Stats notes that early concept maps include Outland, Northrend, the Undermine, Emerald Dream, Dragon Isles as all places, but server limitations pushed them towards Outland instead of more Azeroth zones later on. That was the main reason, because it took a lot of time to fix vanilla and all that stuff, such as where they made everything on a separate map layer. So for example, Silvermoon, Ghostlands, Blood Mist and Azure Mist Isle, and Outland are all on the same map, completely separate. So imagine vanilla's layer is here, all TBC zones are on a whole separate, like completely different separate zone layer. So nothing is connected. That's why, you know, because it took, like, the server limitations made them go a separate direction. It's why we didn't get the stuff added back into Cataclysm, for example, the new zones in Midnight WoW, until Midnight WoW. The servers were fucking cooked, being realistic. Now, initially, it was just all lines on the map. Again, this is from John Stat's book and dev interviews. And the team wasn't even sure they'd do expansions. So when they were building it out, they made TBC an expansion instead. And Outland isn't itself cut from vanilla, as much as they literally shifted from going, this is a new phase, to this is the first expansion, when they finally decided that instead of doing forever patches and forever phases, like forever new phases, they just said, let's do an expansion. That way we can put our focus onto the next batch of content instead of trying to balance the existing BS. Now, I personally think that they should add Hellfire Peninsula and only Hellfire Peninsula, and that they should make it so that we can't get past Illidari forces or whatever, and that, you know, we're limited to the incursion into Hellfire Peninsula, dealing with the orcs, maybe even Magtherodon reimagined as a vanilla raid, but I think that should be it. I don't think we should get the entirety of Future Outland, even though that was a vanilla phase idea initially. I think that is a step too far towards a different version of the game, but certain elements from TBC and Outland should be brought back into vanilla where they do belong. Should Illidan and Black Temple be in Classic Plus? That's a hard thing for me to personally answer, and I'm going to say no, but I do think references to the Illidari, to, you know, for example, Karl Thus, as well as Lady Vash and things of that nature should be brought in. I think they should go to alternate timeline where Illidan isn't a crackpot villain who goes mad for no particular reason and they have to go retcon everything in a future book. I do think the vanilla idea of Illidan being a neutral faction or reputation to farm is, in my opinion, a good idea. The Illidari should be a positive, like a neutral faction that both factions can farm reputation with. I don't think there's a reason for him to be an evil villain in Classic Plus. Now, I'm just going to list off other honorable mentions of zones that were cut from the game. Kazan, Nazjatar, Kultiris, the Isle of Quel'Danas, Tol Barad, Zuldar, Crestfall, Baelor, Plunder Isle, and Pandaria. Legit, all of this appeared on early maps or RPG material long before their eventual in-game forms and future expansions. So for example, Pandaria, it's a meme, but it was mentioned in Warcraft 3, it was mentioned in a lot of RPG material, interviews, dev statements, but Pandaria should never be considered. But for example, we have Kultiris, Quel'Danas, Tol Barad, Zuldar, Crestfall, Baelor, Kazan. That should all eventually at some point be in Classic Plus, because they were meant to be in Classic Plus. Again, all of this comes down to this major issue of the fact that they ran out of time. But the Classic Plus, the Classic devs have infinite time, because the whole point of Classic Plus is forever content. It can take 10 years to get through everything, but eventually they should get through everything. Now, some things should not be, right? Just because Pandaria is pre-Warcraft, pre-alpha, doesn't mean Pandaria should be in the game. I think Pandaria is a step too far, and I think Pandaria is effectively a mockery of vanilla, because it was a meme. From the beginning it was a meme. From the beginning it was comedy and funny. There's this mysterious mega continent full of pandas and a giant empire and lore and stories. It was meant to be like, okay Chen, calm down, you're taking the piss out of things. And then Pandaria happened. So I don't think Pandaria should ever be brought back into vanilla or Classic Plus, but the other things I mentioned all should be. Now that I've mentioned these honorable zones, I want to talk about some pre-alpha subzones and, you know, little locations that are all around the world. For example, you have Starfall Barrow-Den, the Grounded Plains in Dun Morogh, you have Old Ironforge, the Dwarven Airfield, you have a high plateau location in between Dun Morogh and Stormwind. Now this is just some of the many locations, right? Because I didn't even talk about, you know, Eastern Tirisfal Glade, Eastern Stone Tail Mountain, Stone Talon, why I say tail. You then have north of Moonglade, like all those locations right there that were always eventually meant to be fleshed out, but never did get fleshed out. And this just showcases like just how many plot points were forgotten or abandoned or left behind or underutilized or not utilized whatsoever in the context of Classic Vanilla and Classic Plus, that the devs should be able to utilize and should be able to make something happen. Keep in mind, I haven't even talked about Grumbatol or Eastern, for example, I'm forgetting the zone's name off the top of my head. The Wetlands, there we go. Don't forget, I said Eastern for some locations, but Western Tirisfal Glades, Western Stone Talon Mountain. My bad, I'm reading through a lot of notes and I'm talking and yapping a lot. Now though, we're gonna start talking about cut dungeons, cut raids, cut sub-dungeons and sub-raids, because there's quite a few of those actually. And we're gonna start off with the big one, Karazhan Crypts. We got that in Season of Discovery and people loved that shit. It was very kind of true to the authentic Karazhan feeling, which was meant to be a mystery, darkness, trauma, tragedy, the mystery of Karazhan, but just a glimpse of it. And Karazhan Crypts, with the Upside Down Sinners for example, was all meant to be in the game, and Saw did a beautiful job of showcasing that to us. People loved it. A bit too difficult for the classic player base for the most part. As a 5-man dungeon, it should have been a 10-man dungeon. It would have been a lot more tolerable for people. But 5-man was a bit too hard for the average classic player. But not counting that, effectively take that from SOD and pour it into Classic Plus as a max level, like 10-man dungeon for Classic Plus. Redo the gear, of course, because SOD's gearing was very wonky and very all over the place. But I like the idea of Karazhan Crypts that they did in SOD. I think they should just copy the whole thing over. So I'm not going to talk about Karazhan Crypts very much, but I am going to talk about Karazhan itself, the ginormous instance of Karazhan. Now, for those of you that aren't aware, OG Karazhan was Black Rock Mountain size. And now there's two stories here. Original Karazhan was meant to be the first open world raid, so they actually finished this. OG Karazhan was finished. But it was such a shitty feeling of having 40 people or 20 people running through this because it was built into the open world. So it was an actual structure that you could walk into in Deadwind Pass and climb the whole thing. And it was wonky and the devs didn't like it because it felt clustered and like claustrophobic almost. So they scrapped it and redid it, and that led to, like, it was part of the discussion with making dungeons instance. It's what happened with It's what happened with Dead Mines, for example. Dead Mines was initially an open world dungeon, right? It was meant to be in the open world, but they couldn't make it fit thematically and make it feel good. It was meant to be this big mystery, and if you're just questing over there in Westfold, you would just walk by, see it, it would kill the vibe and the mystery of it. Eventually, they landed on an instance dungeon, and that led to the whole rest of the game being redeveloped with instance content in mind. And effectively, Karazhan was meant to be this first mega instance raid, and they just wasted so much time and effort on it. It was so big that TBC Karazhan is less than half the size of OG Karazhan, because OG Karazhan was excessively huge, and they never even finished developing the textures or the assets for it. It's mostly unfinished. So in TBC they did a completely separate, unique way, and I love how it turned out. TBC's Karazhan is really good. So this is a sub question. Should they port TBC Karazhan into Classic Plus, or should they remake OG Karazhan as there's two mega dungeons, two mega raids, because it was ginormous. It was effectively the size of Molten Core and Blackwing Lair. It was so big to the point of excessiveness. Well, it wasn't as big as both combined, but you know, it's up there in scale. So should they keep that and finish that, or should they go with the TBC version, which ended up being what the devs wanted to do anyways? That's a kind of half-half question that I'm very curious what the devs end up doing with Karazhan here in Classic Plus. Because Karazhan could be upper Karazhan as a raid and lower Karazhan. Same thing with AQ20, AQ40. I think that could be a cool thing for the devs to do. Keep both Karazhans, finish them out, and then have one be like the AQ20, one be the AQ40, or the AQ10 and AQ20 if they're doing flex raiding. I'm not sure exactly how they're going to end up doing this, but either way, I think it's going to be really sick, and I'm really curious to see what the devs end up doing here. We now have Stormwind Vault. Now, you guys, of course, know of Stockades. When you go in there, you get boosted for the most part. You sit there AFK at the entrance, you pay your 25G, get your levels, and you move on with your life. But Stormwind Vault was meant to be a raid, a ginormous raid, and it was meant to have storylines tying into Onyxia, the Fire's Brotherhood, the whole plotline. If you guys are aware, there's several story beats that just get stopped and like abandoned halfway through in both the Horde and Alliance. And the reason for this is those story beats had nowhere else to go and continue. For example, you have the Ulduman questline, which is meant to lead you to Uldum, and you go there, and that's it. And the same thing is with Vault. There were story beats that clearly were meant to continue or have more tie-ins or more references, and they just don't. It was meant to be more mystery, where you're meant to go into Stormwind Vault to figure out things, and then, you know, Onyxia and all the BS and all the drama, but we never actually got that. So I think Stormwind Vault, the devs can effectively do whatever they really want. Now, the actual prison is finished. It's in-game developed. You can technically go in there on private servers and stuff, but you can't access it in Classic or in Retail. You have to effectively hack to get in there, or again, private server to get in there. Now, the lore description paints it as a place based on what we've found as demons, rogue mages, necromancers, abominations. But the devs never really gave much information about this. It was just another thing they made and forgot about or moved on from. They clearly had plans for this, but they never went into detail with plans. They just mentioned it and left it be. So I'm very curious how the Classic devs will utilize like Stormwind Vault as the finished idea. Are they going to actually start finishing off the unfinished quest lines in-game and tying things back into each other? This would require going through the OG notes of medicine and the original writers and piecing together the original intentions and fleshing them out and finishing them. Now there are actually many devs on the Classic dev team right now that have been there since, for example, Blackwing Lair for some of them. Some people were AQ on NAC, some people came in early TBC or Wrath. A lot of these people were talking to or have talked to the original devs multiple times or are still friends with them, so getting that information might not be that hard. And I would love to truly see what Classic Plus ends up looking like when you have these unfinished designs and like philosophies of the devs brought to life, especially with something like Stormwind Vault. Now we got Scarlet Monastery. Now Scarlet Monastery, as you guys saw in SOD, utilized the original Alpha Scarlet Monastery instance. The whole mega thing where all 4 dungeons were in one dungeon instead of 4 separate instance dungeons. And the devs scrapped that because it was too long, too difficult, it should have been a raid, yada yada yada. They had many reasons for the scrapping. But I love what they did in SOD, and I think Scarlet Enclave as a raid/zone should come back. With more detail, more textures, more assets, slightly more unique things to the zone and the content itself. But I like what they did in SOD, and I think it should be scaled down, tweaked. The gear should be changed, but I love the original intention of Scarlet Enclave that the Classic devs have already done. So I, in my opinion, think they did and really did respect the original plot and designs of the vanilla devs. I just do think it should be kind of like slightly more unique. Like Balnazar as a first boss, kind of cool, kind of checks out, almost makes sense, but maybe a different first boss. But I love the overall archetype and theme of the Scarlet Enclave raid and instance, and I love what they did, and I think reutilizing the whole thing would be rather cool and would be rather sick, and I'm very excited to see what the devs do. Even if it's just the one-to-one port of Scarlet Enclave, I'm still going to enjoy that and have a good time. But I kind of feel like for Classic Plus they should go a little extra, a little more, a little like more love and attention to Scarlet Enclave as a zone and raid. Now we got Caverns of Time. Now the Caverns of Time for the most part is ginormous. It was always meant to be a look into the past, a look into the future. It was meant to showcase so many things. For example, the OG Black Morass was in a vanilla. It's actually finished. They actually fully designed the Black Morass. It is in vanilla. It's in the in-game files. It's accessible. But unlike in TBC where you port to the entrance of the Swamp of Sorrows, well, the Blasted Lands, before it became the Blasted Lands because it was a jungle initially. And then the Blasted Lands, the Dark Portal opening, all that shit just like obliterated the Blasted Lands. But initially, the Swamp of Sorrows, you entered this dungeon, and you actually had to travel through the time ways itself, loops and loop-de-doos, and then you get to the entrance of, in this context, the swamp, the Black Morass location, because that's what the Blasted Lands was called before, the Black Morass, and deal with the Medivh and the Dark Portal opening. So right off the bat, we already have a Caverns of Time dungeon finished in vanilla. That's already there. And there were other dungeons and plans they had. Now, I don't know how many of the TBC dungeons were initially vanilla dungeons, or how many scrap vanilla dungeons for Caverns of Time just never ever made it back into the game. We don't actually know, but I'm going to read through some of these things, right? For example, in the Caverns of Time, there were several locations pointing towards alternate versions of Azeroth. But again, you guys see the amount of portal rooms, right? I think based off memory, there's 6 portals in the Caverns of Time, which meant they had intentions for 6 dungeons or raids in Caverns of Time. Now, of course, they can always go ahead and like add more, tweak it so there's less, lock them for later. Maybe they didn't actually have enough plans, they just wanted extra space for the future. So they could always say, well, we had plans, we just didn't have them at the time, but we made these locations as extra things just in case we ever want to go back and utilize the Caverns of Time. It could really go either way here, because the OG Caverns of Time notes are sparse. We know they had a lot of intentions, but it's very sparse, so we'd be making shit up right now if I was telling you they planned on doing this or that or this. The only thing we know they had plans for was the Archimonde Battle for Mount Hyjal. They mentioned 1 and 2. That's how they utilized the Hyjal OG storyline. They rewrote that into TBC as the Battle for Mount Hyjal, as well as the Black Morass. So let's look at what this could look like in Classic Plus. They could absolutely still utilize the Battle for Mount Hyjal, but a lot of people don't like it. It's a lot of people's least favorite raid. It's not a bad raid. It's just not a good raid, right? It's a raid that's there. It's slow, tedious, and BS, but it's there. So maybe they don't utilize that, but they keep the Black Morass, and maybe they do the Siege of Stormwind or the Null Wars, right? The sacking of Stormwind the first time by the Orcish Horde. They can do the founding of Durotar. They can do so many storylines and quest lines for the Caverns of Time that are just sick. And they can pick any of Azeroth's events. Heck, they can recreate portions of Northrend and do the Arthur's campaign from Warcraft 3 in this context. They can do that in the Caverns of Time. Or they can do Arthur sacking Lordaeron, showing Sylvanas' breakaway and freedom from Arthas as an instance, a dungeon. So there's so many cool things they can do that I could sit here and theorize for an hour straight. Actually, let me know in the comments down below. Do you guys want the 2-hour mega Caverns of Time video? Because I've got that shit written. I have like 150 ideas of what they could do. I break down the lore and all these cool locations and story beats of what the devs could fully flesh out and showcase. If you guys want to see that, let me know. I'm actually curious. I kind of felt this is like a lore rant that people just like, nobody wants to sit down and listen to 2 hours of what if and hypothetical alternate timelines or hypothetical just the explanation of how those dungeons and raids would look based on old raids and old story beats. Now though, I'm going to go over all the honorable mentions because there's a lot of them, right? We have Uldum, which it honestly should be a raid, and it could have been a zone or a raid. The devs were very 50-50 on exactly what they plan on doing with Uldum. Not because they didn't want to do things with Uldum, but because Uldum was a story beat, and it clearly was meant to be an instance of some kind. But I don't think the devs ever finished the original intentions for Uldum. I think it was a placeholder they left so they could go back to it later. And that's why we got Uldum as a zone in Cataclysm, because that was the devs finally deciding to flesh out the original lore and storytelling. So they went in, finished Uldum, made it, a raid, dungeons, zones, and all that stuff. So for Classic Plus, they could go in any direction. They could make it a zone, a dungeon, a raid, a world boss. Whatever the devs think would fit better for Classic Plus. Honestly, I think any design would work here. They could do multiple things at once, but I think it really depends on are they making Uldum an endgame zone with an endgame raid and like a new phase and like a whole content cycle dedicated to it, or are they going to treat it as like a side piece of content like the original vanilla devs did, make a world boss there, make a dungeon there, and just move on. Anything could really happen, and I leave it up to the discretion of the devs. I'm not too fussed either way. I do think Uldum should be a raid in my opinion, but I'm not too fussed either way. You then of course have Ahn'Qiraj's unused zone, the subterranean area underneath it with, there's so many cool things they could do there. They could turn Ahn'Qiraj into an open world zone, because you guys know on the world map you see that huge part of Ahn'Qiraj south of it. That is the Ahn'Qiraj instance, but maybe they turn it into an open world zone, a PvP battleground where you have to fight the Silithid and all these things, the Karaji, and deal with them while you're fighting the Horde or the Alliance. I don't know what original intentions were there, aside from just being like an open world version of the raid, right? You then, of course, have places like Torwatha, the Elven Ruin Hinterlands. You guys then, of course, have Tyr's Hand and Scarlet Enclave, which I already mentioned, but they can do more for that. You then have, for example, multiple Emerald Dream portal locations. Again, the Emerald Dream. You have Dark Whisper Gorge, again, for Hyjal. You have the Tainted Scar and Ultra Elite zones. These are things in like the Blasted Lands, for example, Doomlord Kazakh. They could do more there, expand upon it. You have things like Duskwood's Ravenhill Catacombs and things of that location. Like there are things they can do with these sub-zones and like these raid things to make them into more things, or open world bosses or things of that nature, but it just does depend on resources. They had about 5 employees at the beginning of SOD, and I think at the end of SOD they had 45-50 employees. How many people are working on Classic Plus? How many people are working on TBC? How many people are working on Mr. Pandaria? How many people are working on China Titan Forged? There's so many things here that go into the back end of whether something is good, bad, useful, terrible, etc. So I'm not sure what the devs really plan on doing, but I'm very curious and very excited to see what all of these sub-zones and sub-raids could potentially end up being and what that ends up looking like. Now, I want to talk about OG level design, because in the original game, the max level was meant to be 70. They explained this multiple times where they said that they wanted to add the game as being a level 70 experience, and they never really went into detail for why they changed that. Because a lot of classes are unfinished in vanilla WoW, right? If you look at vanilla WoW or classic WoW, you can very clearly see how many of the zones are how many of the classes are unfinished. Paladins don't have taunt, Boomkin and like certain classes don't have proper gearing or itemization. Ret Pally is only really good for PvP. And the devs said that this was a mistake and they did want to finish these classes. And if you guys remember, from 1.01 up until 1.12, every patch reworked things drastically. You go back a couple of patches, Warrior was dog shit. You go back even more patches, things were busted and wonky and broken, but nobody had the 20 years of experience to fully min-max the game to the degree that it was min-maxed today. But at the end of the day, the major reason why they decided not to go to level 70 or have Northrend Outland in the game was because during the development cycle, as they got close to the end of like releasing vanilla, they decided that they could increase the level cap later on with later phases. So they chose to do level 60 so they could actually work on the game, because the level 60 to 70 content was not developed. Their original plans for level 70 content was new zones, new locations, and the devs were not ready or prepared to go that far. Hence why so many things got cut, because that is the name of the game. Finish what we have finished and work on other things later. So level 70, Northrend, Outland, so many things that were meant to be in the game took a decade plus to finally fully get through. And 2 decades to fully get through so many of the abandoned content. For example, in this context, we have Dragon Isles. That was what, 18 years, 16 years after the launch of Vanilla WoW? They've been utilizing this content for so long that it took them so long to finally finish everything. So level 70 is something that people have been debating because it wasn't original intention. It wasn't an original design philosophy for Classic WoW, Vanilla WoW. So should Classic Plus be level 70? Should it be based on a TBC baseline of abilities and spells, but in a vanilla world, where they scale all the raids up to 70, where they drop the raid design, for example, from 40 man to 25 and 10 man, or 20 man and 10 man, whatever they end up doing? Should, Crush be scaled to 70? Should Nax be scaled to 70? How should I do this? Should Classic Plus have expansions? Should we launch at level 60, then 3 years in, having the expansion called Classic Plus The Siege of Outland, where we start doing Illidari quest lines and Illidari dungeons and raids, and the level cap is now 70, and we unlock new zones and phases like Hyjal, for example. Like, what is the end goal and the end game development here? Because technically speaking, if the devs made the game level 70, that is in true spirit to the original design of vanilla. If we're utilizing unfinished content or unfinished designs, level 70 is correct. But in my opinion, I think as it stands right now, level 70 is inherently anti-vanilla, anti-classic, and I don't think level caps should be the way they address the vertical scaling and the issues of horizontal versus vertical progression. I think that is something that needs to be discussed later on in different thematics and different ideologies and different ways of development, but I don't think level 70 or expansions is the way they should go about that. I'm not saying I have a better idea right now. In my personal opinion, instead of level 70, they should give each new raid having 10 or 15% incremental power, so that eventually, once we're like, phase 32, we're only 320% stronger than we are from Molten Core Gear. Or maybe 450% stronger than Molten Core Gear. Phase 32 is like what, 10, 15 years of development? If I'm only 3.5 or 4.5 times stronger than my Molten Core character 10 years from now, I'm cool with that. It's incremental power. They can always do catch-up dungeons and stuff, catch-up raids and all this stuff. They can always reutilize, do a season saying, hey, for phase 16, we're going back to Molten Core, new themes, new thematics, Ragnaros is back, but he's got legs this time, whatever the hell they do, right? But I feel like that goes into this huge discussion. I made a big video about this called Horizontal vs Vertical Progression. I discussed it in detail. It was like a 20-minute video, and I think people should go and watch that. But in my opinion, at the end of the day, when it does come to Classic WoW or Classic Plus, I think level 70 is inherently not classic. And I'm glad the original devs scrapped that in favor of making that for TBC onwards. And TBC is one of my favorite expansions. I love TBC. Leave that for TBC Era or TBC Anniversary, re-release, right? But not for Classic Plus. Now this next one's going to be kind of controversial, but unfinished features, unfinished plans. For example, the barbershop. That was meant to be in Classic. For example, player housing. Originally designed in Alpha. Scrapped multiple times, eventually forgotten and abandoned. There's actually a list of every little thing that was in the game that they never actually ended up finishing. For example, they had huge new PvP zones like Ajara Crater and Battlegrounds. They had a rank 15, where only one of each race gets, so there'd only one rank 15 human, one rank 15 gnome, one rank 15 orc, one rank 15 Tauren, you know, Forsaken, etc, etc. And that's only part of the things, right? So, for example, the Ravenholdt reputation, that's an unfinished reputation that could have potentially be finished in Classic Plus. Professions are meant to be much further, much more built in. Items like the Bengal Tiger, Piercing Eye of the Abyss, the vanilla Ashbringer questline, adding the Ashbringer back as a legendary like they did in Season of Discovery. And that, again, that's just part of so many little features that were in-game but never got finished, never got expanded upon. That also doesn't even touch into unfinished classes. For example, there was meant to be more specs for certain classes. Warlock tank, Shaman tank. They were both designed to be in the game. That was a genuine thing. There was meant to be a Warlock tank. They even tried to redo Warlock tank in Mr. Pandaria, and they eventually just gave up on Warlock tank and forgot about it. But Warlock tank was another alpha thing. And again, that's the thing with Classic WoW, is there's so many unfinished things people don't realize that. Death Knight. The original Death Knight was a paladin questline. You were meant to be a paladin, commit an atrocity to the same level as Arthas, which is meant to be sacking a human town, then you convert to the Horde and you join the Horde, so paladins were Horde only. Rune Masters, and the early version of Death Knight, which was meant to be like a monk-like class. So it played like a Death Knight, but it was monk aesthetic. So you had runes for monk abilities. Then of course, like I said, I just talked about Death Knight, which was just Dark Paladin. You then have Assassin for Rogue. That was meant to be in the game. It was meant to be a pure PvP spec. You were meant to be the Assassin. Super strong stealth, things like that. That doesn't even count unfinished professions. You guys aren't aware of this, but there are unfinished professions in game. For example, stealth was a profession. Survival was a profession. These were all things developed and designed in vanilla that never ended up getting finished or never ended up getting fleshed out or developed or designed because they ran out of time. And that is the name of the game, is running out of time. When it comes to vanilla, I haven't even touched on the dungeons yet, guys. Like I said I was going to keep this video under 30 minutes, and I'm about 58 minutes into recording. I'm not sure what this will be trimmed down. So maybe like 56, 54 minutes trimmed down. I haven't even touched on dungeons yet. There are so many unfinished and scrapped dungeons in game that I haven't even mentioned. Like the underwater dungeon in Ajara. I didn't even talk about the Timbermoor Hold raid or dungeon design. I didn't talk about the unfinished Timbermoor stories and quest lines. I haven't been talking about the Stone Talon Mountain, a Harpy quest line and Harpy dungeon that was meant to be in game, the open world Harpy dungeon, which is meant to become an instance dungeon that never ended up happening. I didn't even talk about the Void stories and how we were meant to learn more about Cthulhu and the Void in general, how the Amani and the Blood Owls were meant to be in game from launch. How, for example, there was unfinished races. For example, Ogres and Naga were intended to be in game. And this is just a slew of features that I haven't even deep dived yet. Now this video is long enough as is, so I'm going to leave this topic for another video. But let me know what you guys want to hear me talking about the most next. Thank you all so much for watching the channel. If you guys like this, like and subscribe. If you hated it, understandable, dislike and subscribe. We don't half-ass our hate on this channel, we full-ass it. So be a dedicated fucking hater and hate correctly. Thank you all, Ebonhard out, peace.